Chapter 16. Last time we met a woman of influence in Philippi named Lydia. She was a dealer in purple. And when Paul, Silas, Luke, and Timothy went down to the river because they figured they would meet people there, as generally the river was a place of prayer, and not for any particular spiritual or religious reason. It's just the practicality of you could gather there. Well, okay. Paul used the opportunity to preach. And oh, by the way, don't forget, okay. In fact, let's go back to verse 13. On the Sabbath, we went outside the city gate to the river where we expected to find a place of prayer. Remember why they didn't go to a synagogue? Either the Jews in Philippi were so to me, it seems implausible but they were so secularized that they didn't really, or they were so cheap that they didn't want to build a building for the synagogue. More likely is because 12 adult males of Jewish descent were not available to form the quorum for establishing a synagogue. So they went out there. Well, the second part of that verse is, we sat down and began to speak to the women who had gathered there. Now, one of the interesting things to me is, and this has been interesting to me all the way through I only had 45 years of ministry in churches, but the principles seem to be true all the way through. When you look at the average congregation on an average Sunday from the pulpit, you're going to see more women than men. There are churches where this is not true, but I'm saying take the aggregate and do an average. Women still, in my experience, is... I can't make this a scientific theory that I have delved into on a statistical basis. It's just my observation. But sometimes women are more interested in the things of God than men are. Well, now, the second half of verse 14, Luke records that of Lydia, who was a worshiper of God, but didn't know the gospel. But there, the Lord opened her heart to respond to Paul's message. For a preacher, I think this would be true it's true of every preacher I've ever known, and it's sure true of me. If I'm not getting any kind of response, I'm choking, right? Paul didn't seem to have that problem. I think part of it was he was speaking to people who were hungry for the grace of God and not even knowing that they were hungry. And they didn't know that the grace of God could satisfy them because they didn't know about the grace of God. Well, that is not to say, well, Paul had it way easier than me. Nope. No. It was different, but it wasn't easier. Well, the Lord opened Lydia's heart to respond to Paul's message. This is an interesting concept. the Lord opens people's hearts for response. Now, Calvinists will say, yes, he is the one who decides who will open and who will not open hearts. See, my problem with that is that if God is choosing that only so many will have their hearts open, that means all of those others he will not permit. It seems to not ring true with the rest of the New Testament. Okay. Anyway, I could make a bigger stand on that, but honestly, it's not a hill I'm going to die on. Verse 15. This is a description of her response. When she and the members of her household were baptized, she invited us to her home. If you consider me a believer in the Lord, she said, come and stay at my house. And she persuaded us. She and the members of her household were baptized. Now, we don't know enough details other than what we've got right here to be able to know how big was her household. Was she married? Was she single? We don't know. But we do know. Let's back up to what we do know. She and the members of her household were baptized. We don't know what Paul's message was never recorded here by Luke. Was it? I think it is entirely plausible that perhaps in Paul's teaching he would have suggested that the appropriate response to the gospel is to follow Jesus in baptism. Because baptism saves you? No. It doesn't save you. Peter wrote many years later, baptism saves us, not in the putting off the flesh. In other words, not because we're washing ourselves with the water here. It's an answer of a good conscience toward God. In other words, it's my response to Him out of faith. I don't do this so God is now, I was baptized, now God's obligated to save me. I don't think that's it. I think this is a response that we're capable of making toward God's grace. Well, and by the way, I could say a whole lot more about that, but I'm not going to. Let's talk about the household. In biblical days, the household, this term household, is one of the very few Greek words that I know. The Greek word is oikos. And I guess the only reason I can remember is because it sounds like the oink of a pig. But the oikos was all who were under the roof of protection of the leader of the home. If Lydia was married, that would have included her husband. If she had children, it would have included her children. We don't know about those two things. I think it's a fair, reasonable assumption that both were probably true, but we can't verify it. Her servants, and we can be sure, maybe more sure of this than that she was married, had a husband, and children. But she was a woman of influence and wealth. You didn't deal purple and not make money, generate wealth. And she did. She would have had servants. They came under her roof. They were part of her household. So, did she say there by the river, okay, all you're under my household, you're under my roof, you're in my oikos, we're all going to get baptized and no back talk about it, okay? I don't think so. I think, isn't it possible, this is my interpretation, okay, that Lydia was first to say, I want to follow Jesus in baptism. And on the basis of her influence and her example, her household followed her. I sometimes see, I used to hear it when I was in youth ministry, parents who would say, I'm not going to force my kids into church. I'm going to let them make up their own mind. There is enough worthy truth in that to make it palatable, but it doesn't really work that way. If you don't take your kids to church, how are they going to ever know if they want it or not? I just believe for a Christian family, initiate your kids. I've got half a dozen very strong, very good, and practical reasons why taking your kids to church, unless it's a crummy church, then find a better one, okay? But your household includes your kids. Most American families don't have servants. I don't necessarily think that's a good or bad thing. I just think it is the reality. And yet, we do have households. We do have people under our roof. And if you've got kids and a spouse, consider that you have more influence with them than you know. But if you begin to manipulate and force the members of your household, you'll lose. You're going to lose their loyalty. You'll quickly, I know this about children, if I force my views on my adolescent kids, which I'm grateful that I learned early enough, some of it by observation and other by reading and talking with wise parents that I had observed, to know if you force your ideas and thinking onto your adolescent, you're figuring out how to push them away from you. But if you choose to set the example and invite them to join you as you live up to what it means to follow Jesus, that's when the best things are possible. But, okay. On some of this stuff, I just have to say enough. There's more, not today. So I'm going to say enough. There's more, but not today. Back to the text. She invited the entire entourage to her house. This tells me she had a large enough home to be able to host. Well, there was at least 4, and there was probably more. Paul, Silas, Timothy, Luke, and probably, we don't know, others as well. Again, she was a woman of wealth and influence, and she invited them to stay with her. She said, if you believe me, if you consider me a believer in the Lord, she said, come and stay at my house. And she persuaded us. I just think it's kind of cool that Luke includes this kind of tender thing in his narrative. All right, I'm done for today. We'll pick it back up next time on Soul Care with Stevie Boy.